If anyone from the harbor finds this recording after the next extreme low tide, don't go down into the cave on the north side, even if you see the eggs, even if you think you can still take them and sell them. I did. I was the first to put my hands in there. I stole 3 living things from a place that wasn't mine. And ever since then, the water in front of my house has known my name better than anyone in Cordell ever has. I'm not talking about a curse. I'm talking about memory. I'm talking about something that learned to wait here. My name is Elias Crow. I'm 46 years old, and I've spent almost my whole life fishing the southern coast of Alaska, first with my father and then alone, in an aluminum skiff tied up in Old Harbor. I'm not a biologist, and I'm not the kind of man who chases strange stories. I'm a commercial fisherman. I know how to read tides, currents, and bottom contour. I know when a net comes back torn on rock and when something ripped it open from the inside. That's why it took me so long to admit that I hadn't imagined what happened that night. I'm speaking now because last night I heard 2 guys from the shipyard say they were planning to go down to the North Basalt Shelf the next time the sea pulls back. One of them mentioned the crack in the wall, the one that almost never gets exposed. If they go in there without knowing what's waiting inside, then the blame won't be mine alone anymore. For 3 years I've tried to call it an accident, a discovery, an opportunity. None of those words fit. The right word is theft. Back then I was broke. I owed money for fuel, a shaft repair, gear, and months of rent. When you string together enough bad seasons, your brain starts to rot in a very specific way. You stop asking what something is and start asking what it's worth. That night I went out with a headlamp, gloves, a short iron bar, and a mesh sack. I told myself I was looking for scrap or lost traps. The truth is, I was looking for money. That late March low tide wasn't normal. The moon was full, the west wind had been pushing the water out for hours, and the bay exposed a strip of seafloor I didn't remember ever seeing, not even when I was a teenager. I walked out alone through tide pools full of little fish, urchins, and starfish, with the smell of crushed kelp clinging to my clothes. Past the last outcrop, I found a vertical opening half covered in black seaweed. Normally, the surf breaks there. That night, you could walk right in. Inside, it didn't smell like a sea cave. There was no rot, no seal stink, no bird ammonia. It smelled clean, fresh salt and wet stone. There was a sound, too. Not running water, but a soft, steady tapping, like something small knocking from inside a bag of fluid. I moved forward, hunched over through a narrow passage. On the walls, I saw curved marks, repeating, too smooth to be claw marks and too regular to be random. They looked like traces left by hands. The passage opened into a round chamber. A crack in the ceiling let in a shaft of moonlight that fell across a still pool in the center, a natural basin cut off from the tide. Around the edge were several empty membranes stuck to the rock, like dried shells. In the pool itself were 3 unbroken eggs. They were long, about the size of a small melon, and their skin shifted from pearl gray to blue when I moved the light. I knelt beside the nearest one and saw the outline of an embryo, head, arms, and beneath them a single thin tail curled up tight. The first thing I felt wasn't fear. It was greed. In seconds, I built myself a whole new life, sell the proof, get out of debt, become the man who found something impossible. I didn't think about a nest. I didn't think about a mother or young. I thought about ownership. I touched the membrane with 2 fingers, and it was warm. Warm, like a living body. Then the creature turned toward my hand and pressed something like a tiny palm against the translucent wall. 5 fingers joined by a clear web. I snapped my head toward the cave entrance, convinced somebody was watching me. I didn't see anyone. I took out the mesh sack, opened it in the pool, and slid my hands beneath the first egg. It was light, and it shifted when I lifted it. Then I heard a long, low exhale behind me, almost human. The back of my neck went cold. I waited. Nothing. And I kept going anyway. I set the first egg in the sack, then the second, then the third. I came out with the weight pressed against my chest, while water began slipping back in through the cracks. Before I climbed toward the dock, I looked back at the black opening just once and thought I had just taken the sea's best chance at changing my life. If you're still listening, leave a like and subscribe. After that night, the water started remembering me. I didn't take the eggs home. My ex-wife had left 2 years earlier, but the house still had too many neighbors around it. I took them to the shed on the dock, the one that used to belong to my father. From the outside, it looked like nothing but a cluttered room full of drums, ropes, and tackle boxes. Nobody paid attention to it. I locked the door behind me and switched off the ceiling lamp. I left only a flashlight on the table. The 3 eggs lay wet inside the sack, pulsing with a slow movement, almost breathing. I put them into a plastic trough where I used to keep live herring for bait. For a full minute, I just stood there staring at them, waiting for something ridiculous to show up and make them fake. Nothing did. In Old Harbor, there's an unspoken rule among fishermen. If you find something you don't understand, the first thing you decide is whether it's going to cost you money or make you money. The second question is whether it's worth telling anyone about. That night I answered both too fast. I didn't think about the Coast Guard or universities. I thought about a buyer. The problem was keeping them alive. I pulled a notebook out of a drawer and started writing down what I saw, as if putting it on paper could make me something serious instead of a scared thief. 3 eggs, semi-translucent membrane, visible activity, warmer to the touch than the surrounding water, responds to contact. Then I looked at the clock. The tide would start coming back in less than 2 hours. If I let them die in a plastic trough, any money they might have been worth would die with them. I had an old live well pump, spare filters, hoses, a short heater, and 2 sacks of marine salt for the bait tank. I hooked everything up in a rush. I filled the main tank with clean water, dumped salt in by eye, and turned on the pump. Several times I found myself glancing at the door, sure somebody was outside. I never saw anyone. But twice I heard something under the floorboards, on the side where the water slapped against the pilings. It wasn't the usual wash of the tide. It sounded like a couple of spaced-out knocks. When I finally had the tank running, I moved the eggs over one by one. As I lowered the first one into the water, the embryo slowly uncurled and I saw the shape of the head, the dull sheen of a closed eye, and 2 slits on either side of the neck, like gills still sealed shut. The second one jerked hard, a spasm that rippled through the whole membrane. The third stayed still so long I thought it was dead, until a tiny hand opened from inside and pressed 5 shadows against the shell. I froze, as still as it did. At 3 in the morning, I was still there. I cracked the door half an inch to smoke and saw the bay completely black, flat, windless. Then the sound came. Low, long. It wasn't coming from town or from any boat. It rose from the water under the pilings and vibrated through the wood like a far-off engine. Except no engine holds a note like that. I waited to hear it again. It took almost a minute. When it came back, one of the eggs answered. I don't know how to explain that without sounding like I'm making it up. The membrane of the largest egg trembled, and inside, the embryo turned toward the dockside. Not toward me, not toward the light, but toward the outer wall, as if it recognized exactly where the sound was coming from. Then the other 2 did the same thing. All 3 at once. I'd seen newborn seals. I'd seen fish in holding tanks. I'd never seen anything react like that. It wasn't reflex. It was orientation. I should have taken them back right then. I still could have. Instead, I shut the door, slid the bolt, and started thinking more coldly. If something outside could already find them, then proving the eggs existed as soon as possible mattered even more. I started convincing myself I wasn't stealing them. I was preserving them. That was the most useful lie I ever told myself, that locking something up for your own benefit can be called protection. I spent the next morning inventing excuses before anyone had even asked any questions. If somebody saw me buying equipment, I was repairing the bait tank. If they heard pumps running at night, I was holding a batch of live bait. Nobody asked much. That afternoon, I brought a tarp into the shed to cover the tank and 2 backup batteries in case the power went out. When I lifted the tarp to check the water, I saw something new on the glass. From the inside, stuck to the wall, were 3 wet marks lined up at the same height. Not random smears. Tiny handprints, each with 5 fingers joined by webbing, and all 3 were pointed toward the closed door. I slept very little, slumped in a folding chair with the shotgun leaning against the wall, more out of habit than courage. What woke me was a wet little snapping sound, the kind you hear when fish skin gives under a knife. The pump was still running, but the tank didn't sound the same. The smallest egg had changed color. The membrane, pearly the night before, was now cloudy in some places and stretched tight in others, as if something inside were pushing over the same seam again and again. The embryo wasn't curled up anymore. It had rolled onto its side. I could see the curve of the spine, the arms tucked to the chest, and the tail folded beneath the body. I didn't touch anything. I just watched, notebook in hand, as if writing it down could turn what I was seeing into work instead of a crime. The egg knocked once against the glass, then again. A white crack split across the upper end and branched almost immediately. The sound was small, just the sound of something alive breaking the last wall between itself and the world. I took a step back. The creature pushed again. The crack opened wide enough for a hand to come through first, 5 long fingers joined by a clear membrane. The hand felt along the broken edge, found purchase, and pulled the body after it. Then the head emerged. I'd seen seal pups, gutted salmon, animals born wrong or half dead after storms. This thing didn't belong to any of those categories. The face was small and smooth, with a high forehead and closed eyes under a milky film. On both sides of the neck, 3 red slits opened and shut. The torso was narrow, with ribs visible under bluish-gray skin. Below the waist there were no legs. There was a muscular tail, still soft, ending in a split fin. It came all the way out in less than a minute. It dropped into the water, sank to the bottom, and went still. I counted without knowing whether I was about to pull it out or let it die. On 6, it opened its eyes. They weren't fish eyes, or seal eyes, or the eyes of anything I'd ever hauled up in a net. They were large, dark, focused. They didn't look at the light or the movement of the water. They looked at me. And just like that, everything I'd told myself to justify what I'd done, rarity, specimen, money, opportunity, started sounding filthy. Because there's a difference between stealing something strange and looking into the eyes of what you just ripped away from where it belonged. It drove itself upward with its tail and stopped halfway up the tank. It didn't flee to the bottom. It didn't thrash in panic. It just hovered there, perfectly still except for the slits in its neck. It turned its head toward the door. Then it looked back at me. I stumbled into the table, backing away. "Easy," I said, and the second I heard my own voice, I understood I could no longer pretend this thing existed beneath language. The creature lifted its right hand and touched the glass from the inside. It didn't strike it. It pressed its palm there on purpose. Then it did it again and again, always in the same spot, the eye. Behind me, I heard another wet snap. The second egg had started to open. I swung the flashlight and saw the large egg trembling all over, quick ripples racing under the membrane. The third one, the one that had stayed still the longest, had changed too. All 3 of them had waited, or at least that's how it felt. The first hadn't hatched just because its time had come. It had come out, and the others had answered. Over the next half hour, the shed filled with water, shell fragments, and that clean metallic smell. Another hatchling came out of the second egg, stronger, more restless, with a dark band running from temple to neck. The third took longer. The membrane wouldn't give, and in the end, I slipped a short knife in and cut the smallest possible slit. The second I did, the hatchling burst out, twisted hard, and scratched the back of my hand. Its fingers were tiny, but they left 4 fine lines that burned for days. All 3 ended up together at the bottom of the tank, barely touching shoulders and tails. None of them cried out. None of them swam like fish dumped into a new tank. They watched. Me, the pumps, the tarp, the door. The smallest one rose first and opened its mouth above the water as if it was about to make a sound. What came out was a dry, sharp click. The largest answered from below with a deeper one. The third turned toward the outer wall of the shed. At the exact moment, something knocked once under the floorboards from the incoming tide. All 3 hatchlings went still. So did I. That was when I understood the first rule of all this, even though it would take me years to say it out loud. They hadn't been alone when I found them. Whatever had used that cave as a nursery was still close, and it already knew where they were. Within a few hours, I'd stopped thinking about selling them separately. I started thinking about how to keep them alive long enough to make a better decision. That's how cowardice begins. You don't say, "I stole them." You say, "I don't know what to do with them." That same day, I made 2 trips into town for supplies. I bought another pump, a submersible thermometer, marine salt, new hoses, and a backup battery. I told the hardware store owner I was getting the bait tank running again. When I got back to the shed, the hatchlings were no longer huddled together. The biggest had stationed itself near the filter, feeling the current with its palm open. The one with the dark stripe was circling the perimeter, touching the glass and the seams as if it were memorizing the shape of its confinement. The smallest one, the one I had helped out of the egg, was still too quiet. It struggled to rise and took too long to correct itself. I took notes, checked the temperature, and added more salt without any real point of reference. That was my first serious mistake. I knew how to keep fish alive, not creatures that had developed in a stone chamber isolated from the open sea. The mix ended up too cold and the salinity unstable. I could see it almost immediately in the little one. The gill slits worked too fast, and the tip of the tail started losing strength. I could have called someone. I could have asked for help without telling the whole truth. I didn't. Every decision I made that week came from the same place. If anyone else stepped in, I lost control of what I'd found. By nightfall, the sound came back from beneath the dock. This time it wasn't one long note, but 3 deep pulses, strong enough to rattle the toolbox. All 3 hatchlings reacted instantly. The big one surged to the surface and answered with a broken click. The striped one swam from end to end, slapping the tank wall with its tail. The smallest didn't answer. It only opened its mouth and shut its eyes. I don't know when I started thinking they were trying to tell me something. Maybe it was when the big one stopped looking at me and kept looking at the door over and over. Maybe it was when the striped one moved under the little one, holding it up so it wouldn't sink. Even then, I didn't open the door. I worked through the night trying to correct the system. I changed out part of the water, purged the hoses, moved a space heater closer to the tank, and doubled the tarp to hold heat. Every time I approached, the 2 healthy hatchlings tracked me with their eyes, not fearfully, attentively. Just before dawn, the smallest started convulsing. It was brief, but violent. Its torso arched, its tail struck twice, and the slits in its neck flared so wide I saw the dark interior. I plunged my hand into the water on instinct. It was warmer than it had been an hour earlier because I'd been blindly overcorrecting. I lifted the little one halfway to the surface without knowing if that helped or made things worse. The big one bit my wrist. It didn't really hurt me, didn't. It was a warning. It let go right away and went back to the little one. It positioned itself in front of it, touching its face with both hands, making a series of short, soft clicks. The striped one did the same from below, pushing it upward, and I was still there, adjusting valves, cursing the pump, changing water, doing everything except the one decent thing left to do: return them. The smallest died as the light started coming in. It didn't sink all at once. It just stopped holding itself up. The tail lost all tension, the hands opened, and the body drifted slowly down to the bottom of the tank. The other 2 hatchlings followed it down. The big one turned it over once, as if expecting an answer. The striped one laid its forehead against the little one's chest. Then both of them looked up at me. They didn't scream. They didn't attack. They just looked. And for the first time, I saw something in those faces worse than fear. Understanding. I lifted the body out in a fine net. I buried it behind the shed, between 2 old pilings and a heap of rotten rope, because I was still thinking like a practical coward. If anybody found it, everything was over. I shouldn't have left the other 2 alone after that, but I'd been awake for more than 30 hours, and by then I was thinking even worse than before. I went out for fuel for the generator. I was gone less than an hour. When I came back, the shed was open, not broken into, open. The tarp had fallen off the tank, the water level had dropped halfway, and the main hose had come loose from its bracket. One of the hatchlings was still inside, pressed flat to the bottom, frozen with shock. The other one was gone. I found no sign of the missing hatchling. I checked under the table, between the coils of rope, behind the drums, even inside a broken cooler. Nothing. Just water, strips of tarp, and a thin, wet trail leading from the tank to the door, ending in the soaked planks of the dock. I dropped to my knees at the edge and shined my light into the rising tide. For a second, I thought I saw a small shape move under the foam, but it vanished before I could focus on it. I don't know whether it was the hatchling or something that had come for it. What I do know is that the one still in the tank never took its eyes off me while I searched. It was the big one, the first one that had answered the sounds in the water. When I came close, it didn't retreat to the bottom. It just floated there, almost upright, hands near its chest, looking at me the way you look at someone your next minute depends on, and who, even so, has not been granted forgiveness. That morning should have been the end of it. One dead and buried behind the shed, another gone into the tide, and only one hatchling still alive should have been enough for me to understand that I couldn't keep the thing hidden and I couldn't control it. Instead, I shut the door and started making bigger plans. Under the shed, there was an old storage compartment my father used for crab boxes. Over the years, it had flooded and I'd left it unusable. It was dark, deep, and below dock level. If I cleaned it out, I could turn it into a more stable holding space, and, more importantly, an invisible one. That's what I kept telling myself while I hauled out mud, replaced boards, and ran new wiring. I worked for 2 days with barely any breaks. I pumped the space dry, reinforced the walls, installed a larger filter, and rigged a direct saltwater intake that rose and fell with the tide. When I was done, the tank looked like a flooded cellar, long, narrow, with a deep end, and a shelf where the creature could haul itself halfway out of the water. I moved it at dusk in a blue plastic tub. It only thrashed when I lifted it out of the tank, and when the air hit it, it opened its mouth in a dry, soundless cry. I lowered it fast into the new holding space, and in one hard surge, it vanished into the deep section. It didn't come up for almost an hour. I sat on the ledge with my back against a beam. When it finally surfaced, it did it without a sound, directly across from me. Its eyes were fixed on my face. Then it raised a hand and touched the edge of the ledge, pulled it back, touched the exact same spot again. Repetition, memory, practice. I didn't name it that night. It took me weeks to do that, and even then it felt wrong. Naming something helps you pretend there's closeness. The truth was, I wasn't its caretaker. I was the man who had taken it from its nest. But I needed to talk to it so I wouldn't go out of my mind. So I talked while I repaired nets or cleaned hooks. I told it the time, the weather, the state of the sea. Within a few days, it started anticipating me. It heard my footsteps on the dock before I opened the hatch and was already waiting near the top. It could tell the sound of my motor from anyone else's. If a stranger paused near the shed, it slipped under without leaving so much as a ripple. If it was me, it stayed visible. It ate better at night. It wouldn't touch anything dead too long. Old salmon pieces it rejected, but freshly cut fish disappeared in seconds. It also ate soft kelp, shrimp, and open mussels. I never saw blind hunger in it. It examined first, smelled, touched, chose. It grew fast. In less than a month, its tail had gained strength and its hands no longer looked newborn. The head still had something young about it, but the eyes didn't. It was obvious it didn't know many things, but it knew how to observe fear, habit, and guilt. One night, I came down with my forearm bandaged after slicing myself open repairing a winch. When it saw me, it rose out of the water and came close enough to smell the blood. I expected it to get agitated. Instead, it touched the bandage with 2 fingers, then brought those same fingers to the scar on my wrist, where it had bitten me when the little one was dying. Then, it looked at me. That was when I really started lying to myself. Because for a few seconds, I wanted to believe some kind of recognition had formed between us, not trust, not affection, but something steady, something that could grow and justify my continuing to keep it hidden. I clung to that idea the way a drowning man clings to driftwood, not because it was true, but because it let me keep doing what I could no longer defend. The following summer was the last one I spent trying to convince myself everything could stay contained inside that shed. The tank was working, the creature was growing, and nobody at the harbor seemed to suspect anything. If you only look at what you want to see, you can always find a way to keep going. During the day, I worked as usual. At night, I went down through the hatch with fresh food and checked filters, temperature, and salinity. The routine calmed me. Routines are dangerous when they're built on a lie because they start to feel like a life. The first sign came with the fish. I had 3 lines that almost never failed in early July. 2 mornings in a row I went out to them and found empty water. No school, no predator, not even a bad jump. Half a mile beyond my buoys, the sonar showed normal activity. Right where I worked, the bottom looked swept clean, like something had cleared the life out before I got there. The second sign was the nets. The first time, I thought they'd snagged on rock. I hauled up an entire panel split open from below, not torn jaggedly, but cut in near parallel sections. I patched it as best I could and set it again the next day. When I brought it up, I found another ruined stretch and 2 fish still trapped in it with their bellies ripped open. Not eaten, just ruined. Rock doesn't do that. I started checking the water around the hull before hauling. Twice, I saw shadows sink just outside the clear reach of the surface. I told myself seals. Until one night, easing into the dock, I heard 3 dry knocks under the keel, spaced exactly like the pulses I'd heard months earlier beneath the shed. I went down immediately. The creature was already on the ledge, torso halfway out of the water. It had grown so much its tail filled the whole deep end when it turned. The skin had lost the newborn translucence and now had a matte bluish-gray sheen. On the left side of its neck there was a pale mark, a curved line I didn't remember seeing before. It watched me come in, then turned toward the outer wall, toward the sea. Then it made the sound. It wasn't the short click from the early days. It was a low, sustained note, made with the mouth barely open and the gill slits in the neck drawn tight at the same time. The wood vibrated under my boots. I felt the note in my teeth before I heard it end. There was a silence of several seconds, and from the water outside came a reply, farther away, deeper. When it ended, the creature didn't turn back toward me. It stayed oriented toward the sea, perfectly still, waiting. That detail scared me more than the sound itself. It wasn't improvising. It knew what it was doing. After that, the nights changed. There were nights when I shut the shed, went home, got into bed, and could still hear through the window the exchange of long notes between the bay and the holding tank under the dock. It didn't happen every night. It happened when the tide came in high and silent. My catches kept dropping, twice, on days when everybody else in the harbor ran clean. My engine intakes clogged with kelp. One morning I found 5 small fish arranged in a line on the ledge of the holding tank, all of them facing the hatch, not bitten, not half-eaten, placed there. I threw them back into the water and left, but that image stayed with me all day. It wasn't an animal leaving scraps, it was an arrangement, a directed gesture. The worst night came at the end of August. I got back late with barely enough fish to cover fuel and went down with a bucket of cut salmon. The creature was motionless at the far end of the tank. I tossed the first piece in. It didn't touch it. I tossed another. Nothing. Then it looked at me, lifted one hand, and struck the outer wall once. From the other side came 2 knocks in reply. I backed up until I hit the ladder. I waited for something to climb the pilings or surface beside them. Nothing did. But the sound came again, closer to the dock this time, moving through the wood as if something large were gliding past each support one by one, unhurried, like it already knew the entrance. The creature kept looking at me. No fear, no urgency, with an unbearable calm. And for the first time, I understood the second rule of all this. The sea was no longer trying to recover what I stole by blind instinct. It was teaching me, slowly, that it knew exactly where I lived. In September, I made the mistake of bringing another man with me. His name was Nolan Briggs. He was 22 and did odd jobs around the harbor after dropping out of school. Fuel, ice, boxes, minor repairs. He was quick, quiet, and still didn't have the instinct that saves old fishermen, the one that tells you a day is going wrong before the sky changes. I asked him along because one of my deep lines kept getting lost in the same channel, and I no longer wanted to work there alone. I didn't tell him anything, of course. I said I needed an extra set of hands to haul and inspect a damaged stretch of net. We left before dawn, with the sea nearly flat and a low lead-colored sky that didn't promise an immediate storm. Nolan had coffee in a thermos and didn't talk much. That suited me fine. At the first spot, the sounder showed scattered fish and clean bottom. At the second, silence. At the third, The same place I'd lost another panel the week before. We got a strange reading. An elongated mass suspended mid-water, too stable for a bait ball, too large for a seal. Nolan asked if the machine was malfunctioning. I told him yes too quickly. We set the hook and started hauling the lost line. At first it came heavy like we were dragging rock. Then it suddenly lightened. Nolan leaned over the gunwale for a better look, and that was when something pulled from below with a hard sideways force. Not toward the bottom, but to starboard, like it was trying to spin us. The skiff rolled enough to spill the coffee and send a box of sinkers skidding across the deck. I yelled at Nolan to let go, but he'd already reflexively wrapped the line around his hand. The next yank dragged him to his knees and right up against the rail. I grabbed him by the jacket and saw the water open beside the hull. It wasn't a whole head or a full fin that broke the surface. I saw a dark gray backslide along the side of the boat, too close, and a hand. A hand with long webbed fingers gripping the line before vanishing beneath the foam. Nolan saw it too. I knew from the way he stopped shouting and just sucked in air. I jammed the bait knife under the taut line and cut. The boat snapped upright. Nolan fell backward onto the deck and I went down with him. For 2 or 3 seconds all we heard was the engine idling. Then came 3 knocks under the keel, spaced and measured like a message. Nolan got up first. What the hell was that? I kept staring at the water. I was waiting for another hit, another shadow, anything that would confirm it hadn't been exhaustion messing with me. Nothing surfaced. A seal got tangled, I said. Even I didn't believe the sound of my own voice. Nolan's face had gone white. He looked at the severed line, then at the water, then at me. He wanted to ask more, but he didn't do it right away. Young men still have that habit of realizing an older man is lying and leaving him an out, either out of respect or fear. We hauled what little was left and headed back toward the harbor. Halfway in, the engine coughed twice and lost power. I checked the filter, the intake, and the fuel. Everything looked normal. When I opened the compartment fully, I saw the intake packed with fresh strips of kelp shoved all the way in, as if somebody had jammed them there by hand while we were underway. Nolan didn't speak again until the dock came into view. That wasn't a seal, Elias. I said nothing. The line, and whatever was under us, I felt it change direction. I kept tying up the boat as if I hadn't heard him. He stood beside me for a few seconds, maybe waiting for some human explanation, an angry remark, anything. In the end, he only said, "If you know something's wrong in that channel, don't ever take anyone else out there." He left me with that sentence and with the exact feeling that I had put another life on the tab of something that had already been collecting from me for a while. That night I went down to the shed before I even unloaded the rest of the boxes. The creature was on the ledge, out of the water to the waist, something it never did when it heard me coming in agitated. It had grown so much that the tank was starting to feel small when it turned. Its eyes were fixed on my right sleeve, the one chafed raw by the line when I pulled Nolan back. I held out the burn like an idiot, as if I needed to explain who the water had almost taken. "So I'm not enough anymore, is that it?" I said. The creature tilted its head, then it dropped its gaze to my hands, not to the fresh injury, to my hands themselves, the same hands that had lifted the eggs from the pool. Then it made a low click and slowly sank out of sight. That night the wind shifted south and a fast storm came in, short and violent, the kind that snaps old mooring lines and tears up badly set planks. I went to the shed in rain gear and a headlamp to secure the hatch and check the pump. The rain was already coming in almost sideways. Out on the dock, the pilings groaned with every blow of water. Inside, I found the holding tank churning, not from panic, from force. The creature had torn loose half the filter mount, and one of the boards on the ledge was splintered from the inside. The second it saw me, it surged to the surface and let out that deep note that rattled in my teeth. From outside, through the rain and the racket of the dock, came a reply so close it sounded as if it came from directly under my boots. Then, the power went out. The backup battery took a few seconds to kick in, but in that gap, I heard the real damage. Water rushing where it shouldn't have been. I swung the light toward the side of the tank and saw that the overflow line, the one I had installed months earlier to prevent overload, had torn loose from its collar. The water level was dropping through that open mouth straight toward the outer channel, pulling foam, kelp, and anything else small enough to fit with it. I jumped into the water up to my waist to close the valve by hand. The creature brushed past me like a shot. I tried to grab it and caught nothing but cold skin. It made one full turn in the tight space, struck the loose pipe once with its tail, and hurled itself headfirst into the current, draining out. I saw it disappear through the opening in a single contraction of its body. I shoved my whole arm in after it, blindly, up to the shoulder. I touched nothing except the water pulling outward, alive, determined. Outside, under the shed, something large struck the pilings twice, and then the sound moved away with the tide. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Through 2 full tide cycles, I stayed in the shed with the hatch open, a light hanging over the empty tank, and my arm covered in scratches from trying to jam it into the overflow line, as if I could still grab something. Without the creature in it, the place looked like what it had always really been, an old room propped up on rotten pilings and a lie I had called care so I wouldn't have to call it captivity. At dawn, I went behind the shed where I had buried the smallest hatchling. The earth was open, not dug up by dogs or foxes, opened cleanly. The old rope I had left on top had been set neatly to one side, and the hole had straight, damp walls, as if someone had removed what was inside without hurry. I put my hand into the bottom. All I found was cold mud and a scrap of netting. I stayed there on my knees, staring into the empty hole. If they had found the body, it wasn't because they were circling the bay blindly. It was because they knew exactly what to look for and exactly where. That same day, I went to the North Channel, to the base of the basalt wall where I had found the crack months earlier. The tide wasn't as low as it had been that first night, but it was low enough to expose the entrance. I brought a headlamp, rope, and a short gaff. I wasn't looking for proof. I was looking for a way to prove myself wrong. Inside, the passage was just as narrow as before. The smell was the same, clean salt, wet stone, but the final chamber no longer felt like a discovery. It felt used. The natural basin where the clutch had been was empty, and the rock around it bore low, repeated grooves arranged in arcs around the pool, as if several hands had brushed the stone over and over from the rim outward. I crouched and ran my fingers over one. It was recent. I shined the light on the upper ledges and found dry membranes stuck to the rock. They weren't from just my 3 eggs. There were many more. Some old, almost completely transparent, others still cloudy at the edges. That place hadn't been an accident. It was a nursery. The tide echoed under the basin, and I realized something I should have understood from the beginning, that pool wasn't isolated. It was connected below to the open sea, probably through narrow tunnels that only worked at certain tides. I hadn't found some freak anomaly. I had walked into a nursery. That was when I saw the plastic. It was jammed into a crack at the rock's edge, curved, chewed on one end. I pulled it free with 2 fingers and recognized it a second later. It was part of the collar from the overflow line that had come loose during the storm. A current doesn't carry a piece like that up into a high crevice inside a cave. Something had brought it there. I got out of that place faster than I had gone in. Outside, the tide was rising. On my way back to the dock, I stopped halfway along the planks. Under my feet between the pilings, a long shadow moved past. It didn't linger. It headed out toward open water. That afternoon, I went down to the holding tank intending to dismantle everything. Instead, I stood there staring at the dry ledge where the creature used to rest. There was something there I hadn't left. 5 mussel shells laid out in a semicircle, and in the center a small white curved piece the size of my thumb. I knew what it was before I touched it. A bone. Not from an adult human, not from a fish. One of those fine little bones I'd felt through the net when I wrapped the smallest body before burying it. I dropped it like it burned. The mussel shells around it were not arranged at random. They recreated the shape of the cave basin, rim, center, exit. A simple diagram, simple enough even for me to understand. They had gone back for the dead one. They had returned part of it. And they wanted me to know the account was still open. That night I didn't go fishing. I sat at the end of the dock with no lights on, looking out at the bay. Around midnight I heard the first song. It didn't come from one place, but from several, as if the water itself were taking breath. They were low, drawn-out notes separated by exact silences. On the third answer, I saw pale glimmers beneath the surface, 3 or 4 of them, moving slowly in a line toward the North Channel. Up to that point, I'd still been able to pretend everything revolved around me and the escaped hatchling. Sitting there, I understood the third rule. It wasn't one adult creature searching for me, and it wasn't one grown survivor with a memory. There was a group. There were patterns. There were roots. And from the way they had found the cave, the body, and the shed, there was something worse at work than hunger or rage. There was method. They came back with the October slack low tide, almost exactly 1 year after the storm the last hatchling escaped from the shed. It wasn't a night of screaming at the harbor. It was worse because of how normal it seemed at first. The day had been cold and clear. I hadn't gone out fishing. I stayed on shore, mending an old panel just to keep my hands busy. The first sign was the silence of the gulls. In Old Harbor, there is always noise over the water. That afternoon, around 5, the gulls squabbling over scraps behind the ice plant took off all at once and headed inland. They didn't circle the bay. They didn't come back. Then the dock dogs went quiet. I saw it. Beyond the last buoys, where the bottom drops off, there were 3 low backs breaking the surface at exactly the same interval. Not seals. Seals are curious and erratic. These moved in a line. I went to my skiff, started the engine, cast off, and idled maybe 100 yards past the end of the dock arm. The 3 backs disappeared. The water went smooth for 2 seconds, and then something struck once under the bow. Another hit came off port, a third off the stern. They weren't trying to drag me down or flip me. They were closing me in. I pushed the throttle. The boat answered for half a second and died. I lifted the engine cover. Everything looked clean. When I turned toward the ignition again, I heard the song. It was close. One deep note, followed by another shorter, higher one, then a third, broken one. The same pattern came again from starboard. I looked over the gunwale and saw a face under the surface, not fully human, not anymore. The forehead was broader, the skin darker. The eyes, large, deep-set, didn't blink beneath the water. The gill slits on either side of the neck opened and closed with absolute calm. But what took the air out of me wasn't the face. It was the mark. On the left side of the neck ran a pale, curved line. I'd watched that mark grow in the holding tank under my shed. I recognized it before the head even came fully out of the water. It was the last hatchling, or what was left of it after a year in the open sea. It rose to the shoulders and stayed there less than 2 meters from the skiff. It was much larger than my memory would allow. There was still something of that first look from the tank and its features, only now there was no dependence in it, no uncertainty. There was intent. The others surfaced behind it. One came up near the stern, clearly adult. Another broke water just to my left before sinking again. Farther out, I could make out 2 shadows moving in parallel. They weren't disorganized. They were holding positions. They didn't attack. That was the detail that broke something in me. If they had rushed the hull, it would have been simple terror. But they didn't. The scarred one kept looking at me while the others closed off open water and left only one direction clear. Back to the dock. The scarred one struck the side of the skiff twice with an open palm. The others answered from the water in the same rhythm. The hull vibrated under my boots. It was exactly the same pattern of messages I had heard for months beneath the shed. Only then did I understand it had never been noise circling my secret. It had been language. I rowed back in. Not because I wanted to obey, but because the motor was dead, and because every time I tried to angle away, a shadow rose beneath the hull, and the skiff corrected itself, nudged from below, back toward the route they wanted. I jumped onto the dock and tied off with clumsy hands. When I looked up, the scarred one was still there a few yards out, half its body above the water. I remembered the ledge in the holding tank, the tiny hand against the glass, the row of fish, the little bone on the mussel shells. Everything snapped into place at once. It hadn't come back for food or shelter. It had come back with witnesses. I took one step back, and it came another half-body length up through the water. Then it lifted one hand and repeated a gesture I recognized instantly, fingers closing around an invisible oval and pulling it to the chest, once, twice, 3 times, the eggs, 3. The adult near the stern released a deep, sustained note, and from the North Channel a more distant answer came back. The scarred one took its eyes off me and turned its head toward that sound. The destination had been chosen before I ever got into the skiff, and for the first time all year I understood that next time they wouldn't come to my shed or my boat. They were going to take me back to the cave. I didn't wait for them to come for me at night. I left at first light the next morning, while the tide was still falling. I left the skiff tied at the far end of the dock and walked toward the North Channel. I didn't bring the shotgun. After seeing the scarred one repeat the gesture of the eggs with that kind of precision, Lead suddenly felt stupid. The basalt crack was more exposed than usual. The sea had pulled back so far that the entrance passage seemed to breathe, drawing and releasing water underneath with a hollow sound. Before I went in, I looked back. The bay seemed empty. Inside the cave, the air was warmer than outside. The same clean, salty smell with something mineral underneath. I kept moving with the beam low until I reached the nursery chamber, and there I stopped. It wasn't empty. There were 6 figures around the central basin, still and half submerged in the pool and in the side fissures. 2 were adults, longer and darker. 3 others, smaller, blended into the rock until they blinked. And at the front of the basin, separate from the rest, was the scarred one. They didn't rush me. They just watched me come in. I understood then that they had let me arrive because they wanted me to see something whole. The scarred one moved first. It came out of the water until both hands rested on the rim of the empty basin and repeated the gesture it had shown me in the bay, fingers closing as if around an egg, lifting it, bringing it to the chest. Then it pointed to the basin. Then it pointed to me. "Yes," I said. It was me. One of the adults made a short, low note. At that signal, one of the smaller ones dove into a side crack and returned almost immediately with something in its hands. It placed it on the edge of the pool, directly under the shaft of light coming through the crack in the ceiling. It was the broken collar from the overflow line in the shed, crusted with salt. Beside it came a strip of blue tarp, frayed at the edges, from the plastic tub I had used to transfer the hatchling to the lower tank. Then they brought a metal clamp, a section of hose chewed through, and part of the filter. The debris of my cowardice laid out with unbearable neatness. The scarred one knocked twice on the rock beside those things, then dipped one hand into the basin water. When it lifted the hand again, it was holding something white and fine. It set it down on the blue tarp with a delicacy that made me nauseous. A small bone. I didn't need more than a second to know whose it was. The first hatchling. The one that had died in my tank while I adjusted salinity, temperature, and lies. The one I had wrapped in netting and buried behind the shed. The 2 smallest creatures came forward to the rim and, one after the other, pressed their foreheads to the stone in front of the bone. I didn't need to understand their language to know this wasn't a threat. It was a record, shared memory, and in it I occupied the clearest place of all. I tried to speak, to say I didn't know, that I thought I could keep them alive, that I never meant, but every sentence died before it made it out. Because in that chamber, everything I had tried to call a mistake appeared in its proper order: enter, take, confine, lose, kill. The scarred one looked at me again and lifted one hand toward my throat, not to touch me, but to point at it. Then it turned the palm and brought it to the center of its chest. It took me a second to understand. It wasn't showing me where to wound. It was showing me where things are kept. What they remembered wasn't in my hands anymore. It was inside me. Then the sound came from outside. A long, splintering crack of wood breaking at the harbor. They all lifted their heads at once. So did I. I recognized the sound before I accepted it. My skiff. Another blow followed, shorter and harder, and then a hollow collision against pilings. I turned to run, but 2 of the adults shifted just enough to block the passage. They never touched me. From the cave mouth came the final echo, metal giving way, something heavy filling with water. The scarred one never took its eyes off me while my boat died outside. I had years to decide what I was willing to lose: money, reputation, work. I chose none of it. So they chose for me. When they finally left the passage clear, I stumbled out over the wet rock and ran to the edge of the channel. The tide had already begun coming back in. Out by the dock, one tilted corner of hull was all that still showed, and then not even that. Loose ropes, a floating tackle box, a sheen of fuel spreading over the water. Behind me, from the cave, came one last low note. Not triumph, not hunger, sentence. I couldn't raise the skiff. By noon, it had settled to the bottom off the dock arm, and 2 men from the harbor helped me recover only a toolbox, an empty fuel can, and part of the console. I told them a line must have slipped at low tide, and the hull had banged wrong against the pilings. Nobody believed me, but in towns like ours, people learn not to ask too many questions. They saw my face and let me lie. I thought after the cave it would be over, that they had marked the account, taken the boat, returned the bone, and that would be enough. I was wrong. The bay never touched anyone else, but it changed enough that people started talking. Over the next 2 weeks, salmon avoided the North Channel completely. The dock dogs wouldn't go near the water at dusk. 3 times, small fish appeared arranged in lines on different planks of the harbor, all pointing toward the basalt wall. Not bitten, not half-dried, freshly left there like markers. Nolan was the first one to say it out loud, that something strange lived in the crack along the coast, and if there were eggs in there, or a den, then the smart thing would be to go in with lights and rifles before winter closed the area off. That was what finally forced me to speak. Up to that point, I could live with my ruin in silence. I could lose the skiff, sell what was left of my gear, and let the town think I was getting clumsy or drunk. What I couldn't live with was hearing other men repeat almost the exact same thought that got me into that cave in the first place. If there's something in there, get it out before somebody else does. Last night they were in the ice shed, 6 men and 2 boys, planning around the next low tide. One wanted to film it, another wanted to sell the location. One of the boys laughed and said that if there were young down there, they could raise them in a tank. The second he said it, my hands went cold, because for one moment I heard myself from a year earlier. I didn't tell them the whole truth there. They wouldn't have listened with the others watching. But here, alone, I'll leave the whole thing on record. I didn't find a species, or a treasure, or an opportunity. I entered a nursery. I stole 3 eggs. One died because of me in a bad tank. Another disappeared in the storm. The third survived long enough to learn my face, my hands, and the sound of my lies. And when it grew up, it came back with its own, not to hunt me like prey, but to show me that it remembered the exact beginning of everything. That's the worst thing I can tell you about them. They remember. They didn't attack the harbor. They didn't drag off any child. They didn't take Nolan when they could have. They isolated me. They shut down my fishing grounds, emptied my nets, followed me all the way back to where the guilt started and showed me my own tools, and the bone of the hatchling I buried, as if hiding it could erase what I'd done. They understood the difference between accident and choice better than I did. That's why I'm recording this now, before the next big low tide. Because if you go down into that cave with lights and ropes, thinking you're going to haul something alive out of there, you won't be walking into an empty hole. You'll be walking into a place that already knows what men do when they find something strange and vulnerable. And this time, I don't think the answer will stop at one sunken boat. I'm not expecting forgiveness. If they come for me tomorrow, I'm not running to the channel and I'm not hiding in the shed. That place isn't mine anymore, and neither is the bay. The only thing I can still do is leave it on record that this started with me, not with them. It started with the hand of a tired, indebted man, ambitious enough to call theft a discovery. If you ever find eggs young, or anything that looks up at you from the water with eyes that understand too much, don't tell yourself you can care for it better than the place you took it from. Don't use that word. I used it for months. Care isn't confinement. Saving something isn't separating it. And feeding something you stole first does not make you its protector. If you've made it this far, leave a like and subscribe, but do it for a better reason than morbid curiosity. Do it so this confession doesn't disappear, and so nobody climbs down into that crack thinking the sea forgets. And tell me in the comments something I no longer know how to answer. If you were the first to find an impossible life, intelligent, fragile, would you really do the right thing right away, or would you also start by wondering what it was worth before you asked who it belonged to?